Chapter 20. Joyce's Country. 25 miles away to the eastward from Leenane, across a wild stretch of hill and bog known as Joyce's Country, are the ruins of the old Abbey of Cong. And hither we set out next morning behind a little black mare who would need all her staying powers for the trip that day, and on a car driven, as was fitting, by a man named Joyce, as perhaps half the men are who live in this neighbourhood. Joyce is the local pronunciation, and the Joyces are one of the handsomest and fiercest breeds of mountaineers to be met with anywhere, fit companions for those of Kentucky and Tennessee. The original Joyces were Welshmen, so it is said, who came to Ireland about 1300, and, with the permission of the all-powerful O'Flahertys, settled in this country between Lough Mask and the sea. Why they should have chosen so inhospitable a region I don't know. Perhaps because no one else wanted it. Certainly the O'Flahertys didn't, for they preferred to live along the sea, where fish was plentiful. But the Joyces were an agricultural people. They turned as much of the hillside as they could into arable land, cultivated with the spade to this day and reaped with the hook. On the rest of it, they grazed their flocks, and they grazed them there still. It was a beautiful warm day, with fleecy clouds in the sky, and a blue haze about the hills, and everybody was out enjoying the sunshine as we drove through the village, and turned up along the shoulder of the Devil's Mother mountain. The fine weather had brought the men and women out to work in the potato fields, such of the men, that is, as hadn't yet left for England or Scotland, to spend the summer in the fields there. Usually there were 5 or 6 women to one man, each of them armed with a spade or a fork, and it was pitiful to see the poor little patches in which they were working. Almost always they were on a steep hillside. There isn't much else but hillside hereabouts which can be cultivated, for even where there happens to be a little level land in the valley, it is almost always wet bog, in which nothing can be grown. The patches were very, very small, and each of them was surrounded by a high wall, built of the stones which had been dug from the ground. And at the bottom of every slope was a pile of surplus stones, which had been rolled there out of the way. The potatoes were planted in drills about 2 feet wide, and then, between the drills, a deep trench was dug to carry off the water, for, even on the hillsides, the ground is very wet. And these trenches must be kept clear of weeds, so that the water will run off freely. And, of course, the drills must be kept clear of weeds too. And the ground is so poor that manure must be freely used, and the only way to get it where it is needed is to place it there by hand. And almost every time the spade is driven into the ground, it brings up more stones which must be carried away, until it sometimes becomes quite a problem what to do with them. As many as possible are built into the fences, and the dominant feature of every Connemara landscape is the zigzag tapestry of stone walls which covers it. They run in every direction, up the sides of hills so steep that it seems a miracle they don't slide off, around fields so small that the ground can't be seen above the fence, along the tops of high ridges where they form grotesque patterns against the sky, which shines through every chink, in places where there seems to be no need whatever for a wall, and yet to which the stones have been carried with prodigious labour. But do not suppose that, even with all this toil, the fields are cleared of stones. Everywhere there are outcroppings of solid rock, which the tiller of the field has been unable to dislodge, and around which he must sow and reap. In consequence, there are practically no fields in which it would be possible to drive a plough, and few indeed in which it is possible to swing a scythe. The fields themselves are so small that one wonders why anybody should trouble to cultivate them at all. I have seen scores and scores, not more than 50 feet square, each surrounded with its high wall. I have seen many less than that, with just space enough for a 2-roomed hovel, where the family must take the stock into the house with them, because there is no place for an outbuilding, and where the manure must be heaped against the wall, because to throw it a foot away would be to put it on land belonging to someone else. The land which the family itself cultivated might lie in 20 different places, miles away. This complication, which is unparalleled elsewhere in the world, arose in this way. Half a century ago, a man would lease some acres of ground, and by terrific labour, convert it into tillable land. As his sons grew up and his daughters married, he would sublet to each of his sons and sons-in-law small portions of his holding, and their other relatives would do the same, so that, while each of them might be the tenant of 4 or 5 acres, they would be scattered in a dozen different places. A second generation further complicated things. An acre field would be split up between 10 different tenants, each with his stone wall around his portion. And one of the biggest jobs the Congested Districts Board has had to tackle is that of so redistributing the land that each tenant shall have a compact portion. Imagine the small farmers of any neighbourhood called together for the purpose of redistribution. Each of them suspicious and jealous of all the others, each of them believing that his scattered bits of land are quite exceptionally valuable, each of them remembering the bitter labour by which he reclaimed each rood. And then, imagine the patience and tact which are needed to convince them that they are not being cheated, and persuade them to agree to the proposed reallotment. Talk about the labours of Hercules. Why, they were child's play compared with this. We drove on that morning, down a wide valley, past these tiny walled fields and thatched houses, now and then passing one of the neat little slated cottages which the county council builds where it can, but which are distressingly few and far between. And then we came out into the grazing country, with stone walls running right up the 1,000-foot hillsides to the very top, and the white sheep dotted over the green turf. And then we turned off along a side road, which speedily mounted through a narrow pass, across a wide bog, and so to the head of a steep gorge where, far below us, stretched the blue waters of Loch Nafui, lying in a deep cup of granite mountains. I have never seen a steeper road than that which zigzags down into this valley, and I was very glad indeed to get off and walk, not only because of the steepness, but also because on foot I could stop whenever I chose, and look at the beautiful scene below. The long narrow lake, crowded in on the south by steep bare mountains, and with a white ribbon of road running along its northern edge, past a cluster of houses built close beside it, and with the furrowed fields behind them, mounting steeply upwards. The whole village was out at work in the fields, and the red petticoats of the women gave the scene just that added touch of colour it needed. The mountains on the southern shore grew less rugged presently, and as soon as the ground grew level enough for tillage, it presented such a complicated pattern of stone walls as must be unique, even here in this bewalled district. For more than a mile we drove along opposite them, and then we reached the end of the lake, and struck off along another valley, toward Loch Mask. We were soon on another desolate moor, dotted with the black stumps of bog oak, and then the road sank into a pass as the hills closed on either side, and skirted a dancing brook, and then before us opened the lower part of Loch Mask. I have said that these Irish mountaineers are fierce, and I must explain now what I meant by that. For a kindlier people, one more eager to bid you welcome, or help you on your way, you will find nowhere. The same is true of the Kentucky mountaineers, and yet they do not hesitate to put a bullet through any man they regard as an enemy. So with the Joyces and the O'Malleys. It was here among these hills that the Invincibles and the Moonlighters ranged, in the days of the Land League. Their notions of right and wrong were, and still are, the old primitive ones. They believe in the Mosaic law of an eye for an eye. Murder after murder has been done here, and no one disapproved. And yet a man with a purse filled with gold, or a woman with no protection save her chastity, might walk these roads unharmed and unafraid, on the darkest night. Just before one reaches the bridge over the narrow stream, through which the upper lake flows into the lower, the road passes close to a cluster of houses, and it was in one of them that 2 bailiffs of Lord Ordelone were beaten to death, and their bodies placed in sacks weighted with stones. And then they were carried down to the lake, and everyone along the road was made to lend a hand to carrying them. That was but one tragedy of many such, outbreaks of the feud which started 6 centuries ago, and which only within the past decade has shown any sign of being outlived and forgotten. I do not know when I have been more impressed and astonished than when I stood on the bridge over the river below Loch Mask, and gazed out upon that noble sheet of water, stretching away to the north like an inland sea. It was dotted with beautiful islands, but no farther shore was visible, not even when we mounted a bold crag, overhanging the water in order to get a wider view. We went on again with the lake at our left, and then the road turned away between high stone walls. Only these walls were solidly built, of dressed stones laid in mortar, and were surmounted with broken glass set in cement. There was a gate here and there, through which we could catch glimpses of wild and unkempt woods, a riot with a luxuriant vegetation bearing witness to the richness of the soil. The wall must have been 10 feet high, and after we had gone for half an hour with no sign of it coming to an end, we asked the driver what it was, and he told us that it was the wall surrounding part of the estate of Lord Ordelon, which stretches clear on to Cong, a distance of 6 or 8 miles, the very choicest land of the whole district. Some of it is let to tenants, so our driver said, at rents which are almost prohibitive. But the most part is walled in, with many notices against trespassing posted about it, a preserve for woodcock. We dropped through the little town of Ross Hill, once the seat of the Earl of Leitrim, but now owned by Lord Ordelon, and then into Clonbur, also owned by Lord Ordelon, where the walls stopped for a while to make room for the houses, but began again as soon as the village ended. And then we passed a curious collection of cairns on a plateau at the side of the road, some of them surmounted by weather-blackened wooden crosses. And then, on a hill to the right, we saw another great cairn. And then we suddenly realised that we were on the battlefield of Mura, which raged for 5 days over this peninsula between Loch Corrib and Loch Mask. So long ago that nobody knows exactly when it was, though it has been roughly dated at 2,000 years before Christ. The contestants in that battle were the Firbolgs, the men of the leathern wallets, who had come from the south to Ireland 5 days before the flood, and the Jiddanans, a tall, fair, blue-eyed race of magicians from the north, who had settled on the Connemara Mountains in the likeness of a blue mist. The Jiddanans were the victors, and the cairns we saw that day were the monuments they raised over the burial places of their dead warriors. There was another famous battle on this same peninsula not so many years ago, for over there on the shore of Loch Mask lived Captain Boycott, whose name has passed into the language as that of the silent and effective weapon which the peasantry forged against him in Land League days. Half a mile farther, and a sharp turn of the road brought us into the village of Cong, a single street of drab houses, whose principal attraction is the ruins of the Abbey where the Cross of Cong was fashioned. But the long drive had made us hungry, and so first of all we stopped at a clean little inn and had tea. And it was set forth in a service of old silver lustre, which Betty marvelled over so warmly that she almost forgot to eat. And then we started for the Abbey, which, of course, like everything else hereabouts, belongs to Lord Ordelon. From the road, all that one can see of it is a portion of the wall of the church, so overgrown with ivy that even the windows are covered. But we managed to rout out a boy, who took us around to the cloister side, which is very beautiful indeed, with its lovely broken arcades, its rounded arches, its clustered pillars, and round-headed windows, some glimpse of which will be found in the photograph opposite. There is not much of interest left in the church, but in one corner is a small, dark, stone-roofed charnel house, still heaped high with the whitened skulls of the monks who were entombed there. The Abbey stands close to the bank of that wonderful white river which, coming underground from Loch Mask, bursts from the earth in a deep chasm a mile above Cong, and sweeps, deep and rapid, down into Loch Corrib. And the monks at Cong were more ingenious than most, for there, on a little island in the middle of the river, stand the ruins of their fishing house, constructed over a narrow channel into which the nets were dropped. And they were so arranged that, when a fish was captured, its struggles rang a bell back at the Abbey, and someone would hasten to secure it. We made our way through an orchard of beautiful old apple trees, bearded with lichen, waist deep in grass, to the very edge of the stream, that I might get the picture of this labour-saving edifice, which you will find opposite the preceding page. Then the boy asked us if we would care to see Ashford House, the seat of Lord Ordelon. And for the benefit of those of my readers who are wondering from what ancient family Lord Ordelon is descended, I may as well state here that he is none other than Guinness, of Guinness's Stout, and takes his title of Baron Ordelon from a little island out in Loch Corrib. We said, of course, that we should like to see Ashford House, and we walked for half a mile through the beautiful woods of the domain, up to the great mansion of limestone and granite, set at the edge of a terrace sloping down to the lake. The entrance to it is under a square tower with drawbridge and portcullis gateway, and the house itself is a mammoth affair, with turrets and battlements and towers and machicolations and other medievalities, quite useless and meaningless in a modern residence. and there were acres and acres of elaborately planted grounds, with sunken gardens and fountains and long shady avenues stretching away into the dim distance. But nobody lives here except a few caretakers, for Lord Orgelon, an old man of 73, prefers the south of France. So that Ashford House is deserted from year's end to year's end, except for a few days now and then when a shooting party of more than usual importance come to kill the woodcock. For the ordinary party, another mansion farther down the lake on Doon Hill suffices. But when the king comes, as he did in 1905, of course the great house has to be opened. One reads in Murray, which is a very British guidebook, how, on that occasion, the king and his party killed 90 brace of woodcock in a single day, and how, 5 years later, 587 brace were bagged in 5 days. But it will be quite impossible for you to understand, unless you are also British, the peculiar veneration with which such coverts as these are regarded by British sportsmen, and the peculiar cast of mind which deems it right and proper that thousands of fertile acres should be maintained as game preserves, in a land where most of the people are forced to wring their livelihood from the rocky hillsides. It is only for such great parties that Lord Orgelon returns to do the honours, and he hastens away again as soon as the parties are over. He knows nothing of his tenants. He leaves the collection of his rents to a factor, and the preservation of his coverts to a force of gamekeepers. And anyone caught inside the wall may expect to be prosecuted to the limit of the law. Now, I have no quarrel with Lord Orgelon. The stout he sells is honest stout, and he got possession of this estate by honest purchase, which is more than can be said for most of the great estates in Ireland. But he presents an example of that absentee landlordism which has been the chief and peculiar curse of this unfortunate country. With landlords who lived on their estates and looked after their properties, and got acquainted with their tenants and took some human interest in their welfare, the tenants themselves seldom had any quarrel. It was the landlords who lived in England or on the continent, who entrusted the collection of rents to agents, and whose only interest in their Irish estates was to get the largest possible returns from them. It was these men who kept the country in an uproar of eviction and persecution. Indeed, I believe that if all Irish landlords were resident landlords, the Irish labourer would be better off without the Land Purchase Act. For there are no more grasping and exacting masters in the world than the small farmers to whom the great estates are passing. The old owners might be despotic, but they were not mean. And where they lived among their people and came to know them, their despotism was usually a benevolent despotism, tempered with mercy. The rule of the small farmer will be a despotism too, but there will be no mercy about it. Joyce, our driver, voiced all this in a sentence as we were driving back. "Land purchases it," he said, puffing his short pipe and staring out across the hills. "Yes, I have heard much of it, but I'm thinking it will be a cruel time for the poor." The neighbourhood of Cong is remarkable for its natural curiosities, for the ground to the north toward Lough Mask is honeycombed with caves, made by the water working its way through to Lough Corrib. Geologists explain it learnedly, and doubtless to their own satisfaction, by saying that the peninsula is composed of carboniferous limestone which has been perforated and undermined by the solvent action of the free carbonic acid in the river water. But I prefer to believe, with the residents of the neighbourhood, that it was the work of the little people. The lofty tunnel through which the sunken river flows is accessible in several places, and one of these, called the Pigeonhole, is not far from the village and is worth visiting. It is in the centre of a field, and is a perpendicular hole some 60 feet deep, clothed with ferns and moss, and very damp indeed, and the steps by which one goes down are very slippery, so that some caution is necessary. But there at the bottom is a vaulted cavern through which the river sweeps. The girl who has come along, carrying a wisp of straw, lights it and walks away into the depths of the cavern. But the effect is not especially dazzling, and the smoke from the straw is most offensive. They order these things better in France, at the Grotto of Han, for instance. Another curiosity of the peninsula is not a natural but an artificial one, a canal dug during famine times with government money to connect Lough Corrib with Lough Mask. This was expected to be a great blessing to the west of Ireland, extending navigation from Galway clear up across Lough Mask and Lough Conn to Ballina. But, alas, When it was finished, it was found that the canal wouldn't hold water, for the rock through which it was cut was so porous that the water ran through it like a sieve, and left the canal as dry as a bone. So, there it remains to this day, and one may walk from end to end of it dry-shod, and ponder on the marvels of English rule in Ireland. One thing more at Cong is worth inspecting, and that is the old cross which stands at the intersection of the street with the road to the Abbey. It was erected centuries ago to the memory of two abbots, Nichol and Gilbert O'Duffy, whose names may yet be read on its base, and it is a cross that can work miracles. Here is one of them. There was a boy here at Cong once who was stupid and could learn nothing, but spent all his time wandering along the river, or climbing the hills, or lying in the fields staring up at the sky. Everybody said he would come to a bad end, but one day he sat down at the base of this cross and fell asleep with his head against it. And that night, when he went home, he took up the newspaper which his father was reading, and read aloud every word that was on it. And they took him to the priest, thinking a spell was on him. And there was not a book the priest had, in Latin or Irish or any language whatever, but the boy he could read it at a glance. And they sent him down to Cork to the college there, but there was nothing his masters could teach him that he did not know already. And the fame of him became so great that when Queen Victoria was looking about her for a man to put at the head of the new college at Galway, she hit upon him, and so he was given charge of Queen's College. And his name was O'Brien Crow, and he made that college a great college, and he taught things there that no other man in Ireland had ever so much as dreamed of. I am sorry I had not heard this tale when I was at Galway. I should have liked to ask Bishop O'Dea how much of it is true. We returned to Leenane by a different road, which lay for some miles close beside the shore of Loch Corrib, white-capped now under a stiff wind which had arisen, and studded with lovely green islands. It is undoubtedly one of the most beautiful of the Irish lakes, but even here the shadow of Landleague days still lingers, for close by the shore is Ebor Hall, which was the residence of Lord Mountmorris, who was beaten to death nearby. And as we drove on, our Jarvey pointed out the scenes of similar, if less famous tragedies, whose details I have forgotten. But all that was 30 years ago. The problem which the Landleague tried to solve has been solved in another fashion. The peasantry of Ireland have won the fight for fair rent, fixed hold and free sale, and can afford to forget the past. Just beyond the Doon Peninsula, the road opens up the long expanse of the narrow arm of the lake, which runs back many miles into the mountains. And on an island a little distance from the shore towers the keep of a ruined castle, Cashlan na Kirke, or Hen Castle in the prosaic vernacular. Islands, as you will have remarked before this, were a favourite place in Ireland for castles and monasteries, and the deeper the water about them the better, for it was a welcome defence in the days when midnight raids were the favourite pastime of every chief, and no sport was so popular with the English as that of hunting the Irish wolves. There are many legends to explain the name of this castle in Loch Corrib. One is that the castle was built in a single night by an old witch and her hen, and she gave it and the hen to the O'Flaherty, telling him that, if the castle was ever besieged, he need not worry about provisions, since the hen would lay eggs enough to keep the garrison from want. It was not long before a force of O'Malley's ferried over from the mainland, and camped down about the walls, and O'Flaherty, forgetting the witch's words, killed the hen, and was soon starved out. Another legend is that the castle was held during a long siege by the formidable Grania, wife of Donal O'Flaherty, and that her husband was so proud of her that he named the place Hen Castle in her honour. Still another is that the Joyces were holding it against the O'Flahertys, but were about to surrender, when the famous Grace O'Malley marched a party of her clansmen over the mountains from the sea and drove the O'Flahertys off, and so it was named after her. These are examples of what the Irish imagination can do when it turns itself loose. For the fact is that the castle, at least as it stands now, was built by Richard de Burgo, that first old doughty Norman ruler of Connaught, to hold the pass from the Isthmus of Cong into the wilds of Connemara. The keep is plainly Anglo-Norman, flanked by great square towers of cut limestone. A few miles farther on is the village of Mom, set in the midst of magnificent scenery at the intersection of two valleys, one running to the west and one to the south, closed in by the wildest, bleakest, ruggedest of mountains. Our driver drew up here to water and wind the horse, and I wandered about the village for a while, and stopped at last at the open door of a little cottage, where an old woman and some children were sitting before a flaring fire of turf, and a hen was hovering some chickens in a basket in one corner. 3 or 4 others were wandering about the dirt floor, looking for crumbs as a matter of habit, though they must have known perfectly well that there were no crumbs there. I was welcomed heartily, and invited to sit down before the fire, with that instinctive courtesy and open-heartedness which is characteristic of the Irish peasantry. Let the traveller take shelter anywhere, pause before any door, and he will be greeted warmly. There is an old Irish riddle which runs something like this. From house to house it goes, a wanderer frail and slight, and whether it rains or snows, it bides outside in the night. It is the footpath the Irish mean, and if they could bring it in out of the rain and the snow, I'm sure they would, just as they bring their chickens and cats and dogs and pigs and donkeys in, to share the warmth of the fire. So in this little cottage a stool was at once vacated for me, and set in a good place, and a ring of smiling faces closed around me, and the rain of eager questions began as to whence I came and whither I was going. I wish I could give you some idea of the tangle of trash that littered the single room of that hovel. Old clothes, old boards, broken baskets, a pile of turf in one corner, but scattered all about where the chickens had been scratching at it, a low shelf piled with rags and straw for a bed, a rude dresser displaying some chipped dishes. But I despair of picturing it. And the dirty ragged children, with their bright eyes and red cheeks, and the old woman wrinkled and toil-worn, but obviously thinking life not so bad, after all. A whistle from Joyce told me that he was ready to start, and we were soon climbing out of the valley, emerging at last upon a vast moor, with great mountain masses away to the south, their summits veiled in mist. We could see groups of people working in the bog here and there, and at last we came upon 2 men and 2 boys cutting turf close to the road. I asked them if I might take their picture, and they laughed and agreed. And it is opposite this page, but the sun was setting and the light was not good enough to give me a sharp negative. Still, one can see the man at the bottom of the ditch, cutting the peat with a sharp-edged instrument like a narrow spade, and throwing the water-soaked bricks out on the edge, where the boys picked them up and laid them out at a little distance to dry. There's one will make a picture, said Joyce about 10 minutes later, and I turned to see him pointing with his whip at a little girl unloading turf from the panniers of a donkey by the side of the road. Needless to say, I was out of my seat in an instant, and Betty, scarcely less excited, was asking the girl if I might not take her picture. And then Joyce said something to her in the Irish, and then, from across the bog, came her mother's voice telling her, also in Irish, to hold still and do as the gentleman wished. She was a child of 8 or 10, with dark hair and eyes, and slighter and frailer than the average Irish child. And she wore the characteristic garment fashioned from red flannel, which all the poor children in Connemara wear. And she was bareheaded and barefooted. And her task was to drive the ragged little donkey out into the bog and fill the panniers with the bricks, and drive it back again to the side of the road and pile the turf there, ready for the cart which would take it away. From the place where the turf was being cut to the roadside was at least 1/4 of a mile, and how often that child had travelled that road that day I did not like to think. From the pile of turf that lay at the side of the road, it was evident she had not idled. She was not without her vanity, for she had her skirt kilted up, and let it quickly down as soon as she realised what I wanted. And then she let me pose her as I wished. You should have seen her astonishment when I pressed a small coin into her hand, as some slight recompense for the trouble I had given her. You should have seen her shining eyes and trembling lips. Up we went and up, with the mists of evening deepening about us, and at last we reached the summit of the pass, and dropped rapidly down toward Leenane. Half an hour later, we trotted briskly up to the hotel, the little mare apparently as fresh as ever, in spite of the 50 miles, uphill and down, she had covered that day.